In this video lesson I will be focusing on interpreting prompt texts. Those prompt texts can of course be either a quotation or a poem. So my promise is that after these 20 odd minutes you will understand the reason for the use of the prompt text. You will understand the functions of the prompt text, and you will enjoy an improved ability to actively interpret the prompt text. The reason for the use of the prompt text is, if you think about it, the fact that your examiners are a community of specialists who love discussing literature. They are forever synthesizing materials from various sources. What does this poem look like when it's viewed against or through the angle of that comment, for example? They therefore choose a text that will bring you into the discussion. Of course, they take all kinds of other things into consideration. When they do so, we'll mention one or two of those. The functions of the prompt text. The first one, as far as I can see, is to loosen. It's meant to loosen up your mind and steer you into the discussion. It's supposed to guide your engagement with the complexity of the discussion. Because the problem here is that a literary discussion can go almost anywhere, and that is indeed, in fact, why it is such a challenging discussion to master. Right, that brings us to the active interpretation of the prompt text, and the fact that Right, that brings us to the active interpretation of the prompt text, and the fact that we have some grip on the reasons for its presence there in our paper, and our understanding of the functions help us interpret those texts, of course, because we now know that they really are meant to get us into the discussion as gently as possible, but also certainly by steering our focus in a certain direction. So the first and probably the last point to be made about the interpretation of a prompt text is that it must be active. You need to linger in the text, the prompt text that is. You need to struggle with it a bit, and you need to make it your own before you proceed with the writing of your essay. You must make sure that you use it in your favor. It is a bit like riding a wave. Instead of finding yourself in something of a vacuum where you just have to think about something out of the blue, you now actually have a soundboard right there on the page in front of you that you can analyze carefully in order to get you going and to find the focus of your essay. Because I emphasize an active approach, I prefer a pen, a pencil, or a Koki to a highlighter in this particular case, because circling keywords prompts you to draw lines, and those lines will represent connections with your ideas and the literary text. What I have in mind here is quite simple. I'm just trying to say that if you circle a word, let's say the word pencil, your next tendency after you've circled keywords will be to make a line, to draw a line here, and that line will be a connection for you. Let's say in this case, active interpretation. Okay, and that forces you to consider these links, these vital links that will be so prominent in the writing of your essay. Fine. Next up, I'm going to teach active interpretation by way of an example. The reality is that practice makes perfect, or better, when it comes to this skill. The scope, level, and intensity of your own reading habits will shine through. There's an opportunity here for them to shine through because you are used to making connections. You are used to thinking of one text in terms of another because you've read a lot. For this purpose, I'm going to return to the 2023 Further Studies English paper that I also discuss in other videos. Here we go. So usually question 1 involves the novel, drama and film, but in our case it will be only this one novel for this year. So in 2023 the theme was freedom and responsibility. Nice being and being with. And here begins the question. This question requires you to refer closely to 2 texts from each of the 2 genres you've studied. That is 4 texts in total. Again, we've got only 1. You may refer to more than 2, etc., etc. Then in bold, consider the following quotation and respond to the question that follows. And here begins our analysis of the prompt text. Here we go. Right, surely first we're just going to read it. Maybe read it twice as a whole, because that's how we're going to begin to make sense of it. Art is fueled by rebellion, the need in some amounting to obsessions, to resist what is, to defy one's elders, even to the point of ostracism, to define oneself, and by extension one's generation, as new, as novel. Okay, just on the level of interpretation, a word is going to jump up at us from the word go, and that's the word ostracism, because it stands out in terms of the diction as something of a formal word. And we all know what ostracize means, I hope. And this simply means that you get pushed to the margins or fringes of your society or your group, or that you may even be entirely cut off by that group so that you have no access, further access to them. Good. I think you would agree with me that overall this says something about the way in which art can be not very easy, but also quite useful. That art, in other words, the pursuit of art or being an artist may well lead to ostracism ultimately, but the payoff is that that allows one to define oneself as a young person, and on a more collective scale, that means that a generation is able to establish itself as new. Is this important? Is it important for generations to do that? I would go as far as to say that it's an important job of every generation to achieve this newness, this novelty, because the alternative is unthinkable, that our society will just die a slow death of stagnation, stasis, and so on and so forth. All right, now let's go for keywords and see how they can help us. Art is a kind of a keyword here. I'll come back to that. For me, the first one that I would want to circle, and it might differ from your approach, which is fine, is rebellion. Then there's just an unpacking maybe I should also, mind you, I'm coming back to the word art early. I think, in fact, the entire statement is for a moment resident in this first nice compact sentence. Let's go through those words. Okay, art, well, one can argue forever about what art is, so that's a rabbit hole, and this is not the opportunity to go down that rabbit hole, because that is not what this is all about. Fueled, in other words, driven by rebellion. That's interesting. So art will, in other words, question, and question intensely, because rebellion is a pretty intense word, the status quo, the way things are done, etc., etc., etc. And then there's just something of an explanation after the colon, as we would expect, of this very compact and dense phrase here. The need in some amounting to obsessions to resist what is. There's our rebellion again right there. To resist what is. Lovely definition of rebellion. So I'm just going to link those two up. To defy one's elders, now that makes it even more intense, but it's the same thing. To defy, nogal. That is a pretty hefty word right there. It's not easy to defy your elders. Even, and now it's going to be intensified even more, to the point of ostracism. This is our second visit to this word, and it's quite clear now why this is done. What it's saying is, this is not a happy-go-lucky, easy, everything's going to be fine process. There's a real conflict involved here. There's defiance, there's rebellion, there is the potential of ostracism. And then after this semicolon here, rather well placed, the dividends of all these rather painful actions are enumerated. One gets to define oneself. I'm just going to include those two words as key, absolute key words here. And by extension, one's generation. So that's just a kind of expansion of that. As new. And then the author, Joyce Carol Oates, actually feels the need to repeat the word new with the synonym novel. Because we don't have the entire context here, I'm not sure about why that is. For me, if I was her editor, unless there was a very good reason to retain this, I would have deleted those. The main thing is, one gets to define oneself and one's generation as new. So there's a kind of tension going on here, do you see? That this quotation as a whole formulates rather beautifully and very succinctly, tightly, compactly, with a great economy of words, except perhaps for that. And that tension, I'm going to make a note for myself here, that I might use in my essay, is now very clear, and it's either side of this semicolon. It's the tension between rebellion, which can be destructive and painful, on the one hand, and on the other hand, defining oneself, or a generation on the other. Almost like the old adage that there can be no creation without destruction. I'm just going to add one more moment to my interpretation here by saying that if you were lucky, Perhaps you knew something about Joyce Carol Oates. I don't really. But even if you do know about her, you must write as if you don't, but you can surreptitiously smuggle in some of the things that you know about her without mentioning that. But there is one other rather lovely little moment of interpretation left for us to do, and that is to look at the title from which this has been taken and the date. I don't see that the date means much. I might be mistaken, still thinking about that, but the title is quite a clue. The Faith of a Writer, Life, Craft and Art. And so it's clear that Joyce Carol Oates is writing here about what it means to be a writer. And so instantly there's a question for anyone who reads this, and that is this now true? Is this true of all writers? Can we find this kind of thing in all texts? And lo and behold, here comes the scaffolding. Do rely heavily on this scaffolding that always comes after the prompt, but only once you've interpreted the prompt properly. And here's it. Critically examine your study texts in order to determine whether they, as works of art, each reflect the author's desire to resist what is and encourage us to live in ways that are new and novel. Beautiful little summary and reassurance for your interpretation of that prompt. In a sense, it almost cancels the prompt. I hope you see what I'm seeing here, because it gives us a nice summary of the prompt. We don't need to make one ourselves, although I would still contend that an active interpretation is going to be very useful, because, well, for one thing, it's just so much better than just diving in and perhaps missing the point altogether about the prompt. But for example, my note here about the tension between rebellion and defining oneself is probably going to put me in a very, very good position to discuss my texts, especially if I've read something like a Bildungsroman, where a young person has to define themselves, find themselves, despite the fact that they inherit all these ways in which they're supposed to behave themselves, and so on and so forth. In fact, I would go further and say that my lingering in the prompt, which will take 3 minutes, you can time yourself, go the scientific route and time yourselves on this. It takes much longer when your teacher explains how to do it. But when you actually do it yourself, you'll find that 4 minutes can be like gold. There's a lot you can do with a prompt like this in 4 minutes. So, apart from the fact that I've got this tension, sort of overarching aspect that I can look at, the prompt, lingering in the prompt, has already triggered some other things for me. For example, to defy one's elders reminds me of so many themes in so many novels, especially the Bildungsroman again, where that is just an essential part of what it means to grow up, that you've got to do this in some way or another. Think of A Room with a View, for example, or so many other of those Bildungsroman type novels. To the point of ostracism, that word resonates with literature. Literature will very often try to give voice to outsiders, to people who are not part of the easy mainstream of society. Again, defining oneself, surely there are characters in our novels, and these characters need to define themselves, and most authors will pay particular attention to this. Think, for example, of Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye, who who struggles to know who he is because the society within which he finds himself in New York is so artificial, and he goes out of his way to try and find who he is. And by the end of the novel, the jury's out on whether he's actually succeeded or not. And that becomes a social comment about how a generation can struggle to define itself if resisting or defying one's elders is not accommodated within one's society. In that case, because that society had become so artificial that it's lost complete contact with the reality of young people's journey. Interesting, this word new here as well, because my mind would first of all take the skeptical route here and think, but what does new mean? Is it just the establishment of the same pattern in a new manner? Is it a complete disruption with what has gone before? Perhaps one could say in the 60s, those generations came very, very close to dismantling what had gone before and to establishing a new way of doing things by resisting what is, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. There's so much going on here already in my mind that's ready to take me to the novels I've read. In literary terms, by just having lingered in that citation. This takes us to question 2, which focuses on poetry. This question expects you to refer to at least 3 poems from each of the 2. They used to call them schools, they're now immersions, etc., etc. You are already familiar with this. And then we have our prompt poem that we have to interpret. The instruction is: use the following poem as a starting point for your engagement with the question that follows. Important here will be the phrase "a starting point." We've spoken about that. So the title of this poem is Entirely. I am not entirely convinced that it's an entirely great title or poem, but that just doesn't matter much right now. Let's read it. So before we do, remember the idea is read it, even softly aloud if you can. Read it twice. Make sure you understand words that are unfamiliar or that you haven't seen for a while, and then we can start annotating it, linger in it a bit, and see how it can guide our response. If we could get the hang of it entirely, it would take too long. All we know is the splash of words in passing and falling twigs of song, and when we try to eavesdrop on the great presences, it is really that by a stroke of luck we can appropriate even a phrase entirely. If we could find our happiness entirely in somebody else's arms, we should not fear the spears of the spring, nor the city's yammering fire alarms, but, as it is, the spears each year go through our flesh, and almost hourly bell or siren banishes the blue eyes of love entirely. And if the world were black or white entirely, and all the charts were plain, instead of a mad weir of tigerish waters, a prism of delight and pain, we might be surer where we wish to go, or again, we might be merely bored, but in brute reality there is no road that is right entirely. Okay, I think you would agree with me that the first word that we're going to circle here is the word entirely, because it's in the title. It is repeated frequently. So I'm going to make a note for myself here and write down the word repetition. This word is very, very important because it pushes back against just a set of bland statements by sprinkling into the poem this ambiguity, and that it is because we can't reach a complete final condition, but that things are never entirely come to a point of finality. That's kind of the saving grace here. And I think that is something that's fairly common in literature. On the great presences, which by the way is capitalized, which is another interesting pattern in the poem. Eavesdropping, because we don't, in other words, we don't fully understand ever. I'm assuming the great presences, which is not at all defined in this poem, are things like the cosmos, God, love, nature, what it means to be human, the future, the past, the present. And as we try and understand them by eavesdropping into them, we're never going to do that entirely. It remains a bit of a mystery. I think the poem is trying to be a kind of complaint as well, because it says that there can be a stroke of luck, and we can at least then understand a phrase, just part of it, a fragment. But even that we cannot understand entirely. So I would make a note for myself and say that this poem is pessimistic about our understanding of things. For me, that borders on a cliche in this poem, and therefore it becomes a bit sentimental, and the pessimism is therefore for me a bit soggy and overboard, but that's an aside. If we could find our happiness entirely, what would the consequence be? So there's a kind of strange logic going on in this poem. We'll come back to it. I'll make a little asterisk to indicate that. If, suppose, in other words, suppose we could find our happiness entirely, and suppose we could find that happiness entirely in somebody else's arms, then if that was the case, we would not fear spring. I must say, the spears of spring and fearing it, gee, that image is so out of the blue and it doesn't resonate much for me, or the yammering fire alarms then. But as it is, since we do not find our happiness entirely in somebody else's arms, the spears each year go through our flesh. Do you get that? And almost hourly, bell or siren banishes the blue eyes of love entirely. yeah, this gives me pause. If I was in your position in the exam, I would actually need to come back to that because I find it hard to follow. Maybe further reading will help me understand. And if the world were black and white entirely and all the charts were plain, the charts, instead of a mad weir of tigerish waters, oh, I see, a prism of delight and pain, we might be surer where we wish to go. So, I think it says something quite obvious here. Let's just finish reading first. Or again, we might be merely bored. That is so out of tune. But anyway, but in brute reality there is no road that's right entirely. Brute reality. I don't know where this comes from. Okay, so I'm struggling with this poem, and that's not the reason why I say it's a weak poem, but it's a weak poem and therefore one struggles to interpret it. But I think the overall idea is plain enough, and that is that if the world were black and white, if opposites were entirely clear, we would be surer of where to go because we can aim, it's nice and clear. Or it might bore us. And fortunately then, this is kind of a positive note on which it ends, that entirety, that finality does not exist. Such finality of something reaching its fullness entirely just does not exist, and that is kind of then a saving grace. That it would have been nice to know exactly, entirely what's going on, because then you think, mistakenly according to the poem ultimately, that you would know exactly where to go, what to aim for, and so on. You would be surer. On the other hand, then the poem points out you might be bored. But what the poem is saying is, although this brute reality kind of rescues us because there's no road that is right entirely. It's pessimistic, yes, of course, because then how do you navigate if you don't know if it's right entirely? On the other hand, because it's not right entirely, we get saved from boredom, and we're probably more human as a result, because we don't end up in the extremes of pain and what was the other one? The prism of delight and pain, the opposites of black and white. You get the idea. It's a bit of a foggy poem, but there it is. Now, I must say, in this case, I really look forward to the scaffolding, because that is going to help us use this poem as a starting point for the essay. And here we go. McNeice reflects on how nothing in life is entirely constant or complete. Critically assess whether your chosen poets, through their poems, support his observation that existence is uncertain and never entirely simple, definable, or right. I've already pointed out my qualms with these words and these ideas about the writing of poetry. However, we're going to make the most of it now. So, support. I think the idea here is for you to decide on whether there's kind of an agreement between this McNeice poem on the one hand and the poems you've read on the other. So I think this kind of forces you to come up with a little mind map, but the hub of that little mind map is obviously going to be your interpretation and your analysis of this poem entitled Entirely. I would want to make a note here, and this is something I've seen in these kinds of paper. The poem that's chosen is usually quite straightforward and simple, like this one. It will not be the densest of poems with a rich diction, an enormous rhyme scheme, and so on and so forth, because that would not be fair to candidates due to time constraints and so on. So the idea is really that this is kind of a bridge into the discussion. However, if you feel like returning to it and not only using it as a starting point, that's fine. If it jumps up at you in paragraph 3 or 4, that's fine. And if you feel like mentioning the effects of the line breaks, which in this case are perhaps not enormously attractive or compelling, because and when we try to, why does it end there? Eavesdrop on the great, why does it end there? But because that is a major thing to do, just to interrupt a sentence like that. So there must be good artistic reasons for that kind of thing, as we try to eavesdrop on the great. I know it's arguable, but for me there's no real feel for the line break here. But that, again, that is not the issue here. The issue here is to relate the gist here of the meaning of this poem with your poems that you've read. What I wanted to say in that long-winded way was to say that if you do feel that it just makes sense and it's easy and spontaneous to mention, for example, the fact that the word entirely is repeated and highlighted in the title. In other words, a formal aspect of the poem, then do bring that in, because that shows that you have engaged with this text not only as a kind of a little newspaper article, but indeed as a poem. Another point that we can make, that I should make here, just to clarify things as far as I can, is that you may say, but if the teacher struggles with the material, then how on earth can you expect the students to succeed when they read it? Now, this is an argument that I frequently hear among colleagues, and it's a false argument. Because the premise is false. The premise is that teachers know everything, and that they then must convey that entire knowledge entirely to their students, who are therefore also not allowed to struggle and grapple with things. The reality, at least in literary studies, is that we're all grappling. We're all mad here. It's not a matter of the teacher knowing everything. My motto, after having completed a PhD and after having researched literature quite extensively and having given talks at Boston or in New York, San Francisco, wherever about it, is indeed this: the more you know that you don't know. What academia will ultimately teach you, and what all our learning will ultimately teach us, is humility. It's humility. You must now, members of the jury, dismiss all my critique and criticism of this poem and just focus on it as an entry into the reading of your essay, and I think we have a fair grip on its relative meaning in terms of the fact that not knowing things entirely can be a kind of saving grace, even though it may also lead to despair. We now have to carry that over to our poems. But let us just then hide in the scaffolding, because I think the scaffolding is going to be our rescue here. The scaffolding, I mean, is how they gently lead you from having read the poem into your essay by supplying a little bridge like this. There's the bridge, there's the scaffolding I'm talking about. McNeice reflects on how nothing in life is entirely constant or complete. Critically assess whether your chosen poets, through their poems, support his observation that existence is uncertain and never entirely simple, definable, or right. I have told you that I have serious qualms with the word support. Poems don't support anything. They just are themselves. And that's what makes them magical and interesting in the first, last, and middle place. So we've got to figure out the word support here. And I'm going to go to the dictionary for that. Now, you're not allowed to have a dictionary in your exam venue, I do understand that, but this is a lesson, so it's not exam, so I can still look for the word. I do want to say that I do hope that you've got a dictionary and that you make use of it at least once a day. If you're serious about language, and you should be, then that should be the case. I hope one day you will read Malcolm X's story about how he taught himself to read and write properly in prison by reading his dictionary every day. It's a remarkable story. What are we looking for? Support. We're nearly there. Supersede, supersonic, supine, supper, supply, support. Okay, let's have it. I don't think it's got to be in focus there for you, so just follow my reading, please. Here, all or part of the weight of something. Bear, sorry. So that's in the literal sense. 2, give help, encouragement, or approval. That's not in the literal sense. 3, be actively interested in a sports team. 4, provide with a home and the necessities of life, i.e. the husband or the wife supports their family. 5, provide enough food and water for life to exist. 6, confirm or back up. The studies support our findings, so that's in quite a narrow scientific sense, which poems just don't do. Noun, 1, a person or thing that supports. 2, the action of supporting. 3, help, encouragement, or approval. And certainly we're looking at the verb here. And you see my dilemma with this word. What does it have to do with poetry? Does poetry even give help, encouragement, or approve? And how can one poem approve another poem without the two even knowing about each other? Do you get my drift here? I hope you do. All right, people, we have no choice. We have to, my conclusion here is that support in this context means something very broad and rough, like, and I'm going to write it down here for you, like agree or resonate. Okay? Do your poems agree? Do they resonate? Do they confirm? That's another nice word. Or do they differ from? That's the opposite condition. Do they differ from the, what's the word they use here? Observation. From the observation made in the McNeice poem. All right, and even though the McNeish poem is muddled, as I've unmistakably demonstrated, we'll have to stick with what we've decided happens to be its observation, vis-a-vis, as we've said, that it is, despite a kind of resigned tone of despair, it does vaguely point to some kind of optimistic observation that the fact that we don't know entirely is a kind of saving grace. At the very least, according to the conclusion of the poem, it rescues us from boredom, of all things. Now, you may feel I'm a bit harsh on the poem, and I'll completely accept that. I'll completely accept that. I want us to differ. I want us to challenge one another, etc., etc. Okay, so the poems we've read, and this is now the exercise that you're going to go into, and this is my final remark for the day about interpreting a prompt. So, here's our McNeish poem. What's the spelling there? Is it with a cap? Yes, I'm pretty sure it is. I'll correct it if necessary. Oh, by the way, it springs to mind, I'm sorry, my brain is a bit foggy at the moment for various reasons, but I said there's a kind of logic in the poem, and the logic is that even though we want to know things entire. Oh, am I off the page here? We want to know things entirely. We feel that would be the safer option. But knowing them entirely might bring us into trouble. So knowing entirely is good or desirable. Good is not a good word. Desirable is much better. No, desirable. Knowing entirely is actually not desirable. And it fools around with this contradictory logic. It's one way of summarizing the poem for ourselves. Anyway, so the McNeish poem and then our poems. Let's have them here. All right, we've got the leaf poem. We've got the hummingbird poem. We've got the wheelbarrow poem. They don't have titles, so we're calling them by those names. We refer to them like that. That's fine. We have the Wordsworth sonnet. I'm going to abbreviate it here rather crudely, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. We've got the two Maya Angelou's Caged Bird. Still I Rise. Wow. All right. Now, I must tell you, I think you'll agree with me that this is going to be a stretch. I'm thinking let us just anchor our thinking about this for a moment by writing out the gist of the McNeish poem. It's there in the scaffolding. Let's go back to the scaffolding. That's going to help us. Okay. Their poems. Do they support the observation that existence is uncertain and never entirely simple, definable, or right? Can existence be right, people? Yeah, I've got so many dilemmas here. I think we're getting a better paper soon. Now we just gotta have to hope for one. Now, can existence be right? Can it be wrong? It's such an artificial construction. But we know what they mean. Let's be forgiving and look behind the words. All right. I think actually these three poems, I think you're going to agree with me, really confirm and affirm existence. It does not doubt in the same way as the Macnish poem. Gosh. These poems do not doubt that existence is entire. For them, there is something entire about natural existence. Natural being enjoys a kind of fullness. And so does our participation in natural being, our embodied participation. So much depends on the white chickens, the rainwater. Encountering a hummingbird nest is magical. We are at one with the leaf, even though the leaf is a sign of even though the leaf, let's say, represents loneliness. That loneliness is kind of entire, if you understand what I'm saying. Whereas I think these three guys do resonate with the idea, these poems, that life is, or existence, which is more formal, perhaps more precise, that existence is very far from entire, far from complete, far from it's broken even. Our relationship with nature is broken. Our relationship with other races is broken. Does it make sense? I think it does. I think we now have a broad grip on the direction that our essay is going to take. Thanks to a careful interpretation of the poem and the scaffolding that's offered. Now, I immediately want to cancel that royal we, that we have an idea of our essay. I want to relativize that instantly. I do that. I know it's an irritating habit, but it's an important one. And I want to say, I, for my essay, now have an idea, because I'm pretty sure that there are all kinds of potentials here where you could argue it differently. And all of this, which seems, again, much longer when your teacher explains it than it's actually going to take you in real time in the exam. Our minds are so beautifully swift, like swords or scalpels, that we may now begin to formulate a sentence, and if I may be so mechanistic, a sentence that will probably appear roughly in the second paragraph of our essay, because we're using the prompt poem as a starting point, right? And you might actually say something like, and I'm going to put it crudely and then refine it, 3 of the poems and by the way, I see it's okay to use this. I studied resonate with and now we're forced to use their words, which is not bad, people, because remember, it is a conversation, like I've pointed out with the observation made in Magnesius. And do honor the poem by giving poem entitled. Do use that word. It's the right word, people, and it's the only one. I know it sounds awfully formal. Poem entitled, but it's good. It does the work. Magnesius poem, what's the title again? Entirely. Remember, we use single inverted commas and we put the full stop after the inverted comma. Always. And then, let's go for a comma. Whereas, and what a lovely word, because that says, dear reader, there's going to be a contrast here now. Look out. Isn't that nice? Just one word for all of that. Whereas, the further three, the other three, and I think I have studied speaks for itself here, so I'm not going to say that. Do not. Maybe I can stretch this piece of chewing gum a bit further and go for a since. Since they confirm the fullness of natural being. Would you agree I've got a grip on all of it now? And all of that work that we put in here upstairs with the analysis now come bear fruit, and we've got, I would agree that my sentence is awfully formal, but I don't mind because it does do the work. Maybe on some other occasion I've got a brighter mind for a bit of flair or something. I don't today. So I'll be humble and stay formal. So let's just go over that again. 3 of the poems I studied resonate with the observation made in Magnesius' poem entitled Entirely, whereas the other 3 do not, since they confirm the fullness of natural being. I think I can argue this successfully with excellent examples. And that's really the point to which the interpretation of the prompt poem should bring us. I've kept my promise, my promises. Here they are again. There's now, for each of you, a better understanding of the reason for the use of the prompt text, mainly to get you into the conversation as a literary scholar, understanding the functions, to loosen up those brain cells and to make you aware of the complexity of the discussion, and also to guide and trim and steer that complexity on your behalf. And then, for me, the highlight of this lesson, you'll be enjoying an improved understanding of the active interpretation of a prompt text, where instead of telling what to do, I showed you how it works,